Hey folks, good afternoon. Thank you for coming by for this session. My name is Vijay Tiwari. I run the team that's responsible for the software that allows you to manage Azure Stack in your environments, and also responsible for the hardware infrastructure that it runs on, as well as the underlying architecture of Azure Stack. So that's all a responsibility of me and my team. There are quite a few of the team members here actually here. If you could raise your hands. They're mostly here to make sure that I don't say stuff that I'm not supposed to. So, but they're a great bunch of folks, and they're going to be delivering the bulk of the detail during the rest of the week. So this is really intended to be a kickoff if you want to understand the architecture of Azure Stack, how do you actually operate it, and inclusive of how do you monitor it, how do you patch it. All those things are sort of what I'm going to cover at a high level. And then we'll go down and cover it deeply. I'm sorry I got in between you and lunch. I know Mark and Jeffrey's session just got over at noon, so I know it's a little bit of a tight haul, but thank you so much for coming by, and let's get started. So I'm not going to spend too much time, but I just wanted to make sure you've seen the slide. We really want to make sure that we get an opportunity to get feedback from you. So please do register yourself, go to this link, and we'll reach out to you to have subsequent conversations on a more one-on-one basis. All right, so what is the objective of this session, right? The important part is that you should be able to understand how to plan for Azure Stack, what happens when you place an order for an integrated system, what activities are you required to do. Then once it arrives in your data center, what happens, how does it get integrated into your data center at a high level. Then you need to focus on, okay, you've got it there, now how do you operate it? So I'll talk a little bit about that. And if there's anything else you want to take away from the session, just remember they're recording it, so in the future you can always come back. So don't worry about it. All right, so what is Azure, right? Or rather, what is Azure Stack? So when we talk to a lot of customers, it is really vital for them that they needed the ability to have cloud-based applications, but in the context of their own data centers. Because the applications that they were trying to deploy or operate or manage needed certain regulatory reasons why they needed to be in a particular geography. They were on ships or submarines or so on and so forth, where they could not be connected to the public cloud. So having an application that runs in the public cloud does not really work for them. And so therefore, we came up with the context of Azure Stack, whose intent is to sort of bring the cloud paradigm to customers in their own data center. And that is really what Azure Stack is. And I think it is important for you to understand that the philosophical approach of Azure is what carries forward in Azure Stack. So just like in Azure, you don't get to pick up the hood and say, you know what, I want to put a SAN here, and I want to put a different network switch here. Similarly, in Azure Stack, you don't get to pick up the hood and say, I want to do this and I want to do that. That is really the value that Azure Stack brings in terms of the integrated approach and the system. And then you really focus on sort of operating it as simply as you can, and we've tried to provide the tools for that. And then you actually focus on providing business value to the customers who are operating applications on top of Azure Stack. So this is an important slide because it tries to draw a parallel between how you should think about operating Azure Stack in your data center, right? So we have revamped our entire learning curriculum for IT pros in the context of Azure. There is an Azure learning path. And as a part of that, we have added a new certification, if you will, which I'll talk about. It's called the Stack Operator. And the Azure Stack Operator is the one who will have he or she will have hands on keyboard to be able to operate Azure Stack when it lies in your data center, which is different from what it is when you're talking about Azure, because in the context of Azure, it is Microsoft engineers who actually have hands on keyboard and actually do the operations in the context of Azure. So what we've had to do is to develop tooling which allows all of you to be able to operate Azure Stack in your data center. And I'm going to try and sort of shed light on the underlying architectural underpinnings and the approach that we have taken for you to be able to operate Azure Stack in your data center. So I'm happy to announce the fact that we are going to make available a new certification for IT pros. It's called Azure Stack Operator Certification. The certification itself will be available early in calendar year 18, But the training material for that certification is available or starting to be available now on the Learning Path sites. And I have links there at the bottom of the site. So as an IT professional, you can actually start going to that site, getting familiar with the tools, the skills that are required for you to be able to operate Azure Stack. And when we have the certification available in January, you'll be able to actually go and certify yourself and put it on your resume as a skill that you have in addition to Azure Stack, other Azure skills. Now, the good news is that these are skills that you already know. You already understand how to work with Windows in general. You understand PowerShell. You understand Azure or the UI and so on and so forth. So I think we've tried to really make it build upon the skills that you already have. So let's talk a little bit about, how did we actually think about bringing Azure into your data center? So this picture, on one side talks about what it looks like in Azure. And the important thing to recognize is the top of the stack. Now, this is not a clear architecture, it's more like a architecture, but it does get the message across. If you look at the top of the stack of how a customer interacts with Azure, you interact with PowerShell, REST APIs, Visual Studio, going through the portal directly. The exact same portal and the exact same experiences are the ones that you can benefit and experience in the context of Azure Stack as well. So the same tooling, whether it's PowerShell, whether it's developer tooling, or whether it happens to be REST APIs, or whether it happens to the portal, you can interact with them on your Azure Stack instance as well. And underpinning all these is basically the engine which powers Azure, which is called Azure Resource Manager. Now, the Azure Resource Manager allows you to encapsulate your applications into a JSON template. And then when you feed that into Azure Resource Manager, the Azure Resource Manager then basically pulls and tugs on the underlying resource that it manages and deploys the application for you and allows you to manage and operate that application as one unit. Now, underpinning that is the actual cloud infrastructure that Azure runs on, right? And Azure, a single cluster, for example, in Azure is about 800 servers. If we were to tell you that in order for you to get Azure in a data center, we're going to give you, or you have to go invest in 800 servers, I can tell you that most of you would not come to the session because for most customers, that would be out of the reach for customers to make that happen. So if you look at the bottom of the stack in the context of Azure Stack, you see that there are some subtle differences. And the subtle differences really lie in the fact that our goal is to bring Azure Stack to you in a scale and form factor that's meaningful for you to get started. So unlike Azure, where the single cluster starts at about 800 servers, in Azure Stack, the smallest cluster starts at just 4 physical servers, plus 3 switches, and plus 1 more hardware server, which I'll talk of a little later. And so there's a lot of work that we have to engineer to make sure that we can deploy a subset of Azure onto that hardware infrastructure. And then once we do that, we have to make sure that we keep it updated so that it's consistent with the new Azure capabilities that come from there, right? The other thing that we have to do is that in Azure, you log into the portal and you have access to hundreds of resources and services that are available. Now, if I were to say that you're required to have all those services on Azure Stack, your requirements for hardware infrastructure will correspondingly increase. So in Azure Stack, you as customers can pick and choose which of the Azure services you want in your Azure Stack environment. And that is another change because unlike in Azure, where you get all the services, here you have to make the choice depending upon what your customers are asking you for, you can deploy those services on Azure Stack itself. So how does Azure Stack get delivered? As you're probably well aware, it is delivered as an integrated system. And we have 4 partners today who are taking orders for systems. There's HP, Dell, Lenovo, who are actually already shipping systems because they started taking orders a little way back, and Cisco, which is starting to take orders at Ignite. So we've got 4 partners who are actually working with us in a joint manner to actually deliver systems. We've also announced a partnership with Intel and Wortman, who is they go under the name of Terra Cloud in Europe, and they're also going to offer Azure Stack as an integrated solution. And the last one we've announced is Huawei, who will be shipping systems sometime in early calendar year 18. So these are the partners we have that you can actually go order Azure Stack integrated systems from. In addition, There are some partners who are actually offering Azure Stack as a fully managed service, where if you want to go to, look, I just want you to roll in the rack to my data center, and I will just consume it just like I consume Azure, but you take care of managing it for me and things like that. And a great example of a partner like that is Avanade, who is also making Azure Stack available as a fully managed service. So you can go to them and they'll give you one bill for everything that's running in the context of Azure Stack. Okay, the important thing here to note is that with each of these partners, this isn't that we just toss over the architecture document to them and they go do all their work. This is a joint engineering effort. From my perspective, my team includes obviously all the people who are here to stop me from saying something wrong. But in addition to that, it also includes all the hardware partners. They are literally an extension of our team. There is no distinct, you can't just go and say, well, HP, you do this, and Microsoft, why aren't you able to do this? It is a joint decision between the partner and us to make sure when we design the system, we engineer it, we validate it, and we continuously validate it. It is not that we do the validation once and just let it go, because each time we ship an update or the hardware partner ships an update, we have to make sure that the system is continually supportable by both of us. All right, so what exactly did we do to make Azure Stack happen? Before I go there, I've just got a very simple picture here which shows you what an Azure Stack integrated system looks like. This one is the smallest unit you can buy. It's 4 servers of compute and storage because it's a hyper-converged architecture. Uses Windows Server 16 under the covers with storage spaces direct. So those 4 servers are basically which constitute the hyper-converged infrastructure, right? We use 2 top-of-rack switches. Right now they're 10 gig switches, and we have 1 BMC switch which allows it to get to the physical baseboard management controller on each of these servers. Now, this basically provides the underlying physical substrate on which we actually deploy Azure Stack software. And that is what creates the Azure abstractions. The Azure Storage, Azure Blob, the ability to create virtual machines, the ability to create virtual networks, all is sort of laid out on top of this physical infrastructure. And the way this infrastructure is laid out, the way the ACLs are laid out, the way the VLANs are set up under the covers, are all dictated by that architecture for Azure Stack. In addition, you will also see there is another host at the bottom of this thing called Hardware Lifecycle Host. Now, this is where the hardware partner can run tooling. For example, when they need to update their switches, or they need to update the firmware in terms of the BIOS or the BMC. So that's where some of that tooling actually runs. And so it's important to recognize it's about a quarter rack worth of gear, which is the smallest instance that you can buy. So what did we exactly do and how did we come about this? So the first thing we did was we actually looked at Azure to figure out what do we need to actually bring Azure services on top of Azure Stack. And then on top of that, we actually layered that on top of a hyper-converged storage architecture, which allows us also to have a storage abstraction as well as a virtual network abstraction, which sits on the SDN stack for Windows Server 2016. And so we worked with the partners to actually realize an implementation for this architecture. They defined hardware SKUs. We went back and forth and defined what that SKU actually looks like. Then we've developed a ton of automation, which is used by the hardware partner to actually deploy the software on the stamp when they actually, or the scale unit, when they actually come to your data center. We actually have a service that we run in the cloud, which actually validates the partner system continually. It's called validation as a service, and we run this continually, and the partners are required to run this continually to make sure that before and after updates, the system continues to work effectively. They obviously don't run it on your systems, but they run it on their testbed environments that they have in the lab. We have developed an integrated monitoring capability, so you can actually get alerts when things are failing, and because we know what exactly the system is, it's a highly simplified monitoring capability that's in the stack itself. Working with hardware partners, I'm sure all of you know that hardware does fail. So we've provided automation to them so that in case a server fails, they know exactly what steps to take, how to remove the server, how to put in a new server, and how that server then gets recycled back into the pool. Patching and update, one of the biggest investments that we've had to make in the context of Azure Stack. Now, Azure Stack, like Azure, needs to be kept updated at a fairly regular cadence. We are going to ship updates on a monthly basis with Azure Stack. And each monthly update can include security fixes, it can include bug fixes, and it will include features, right? And so obviously between us and the partner, we do a ton of validation before we give it out. But more importantly, we don't just give you the payload and say, you figure out how to apply it. There is an orchestration engine included in Azure Stack, which actually takes that payload and then rolls it out over the underlying infrastructure and all the Azure and all the base core services that we deliver as a part of Azure Stack. Now, obviously, because it's going to be vital infrastructure in environments, we need to make sure that we provide you an approach so you can actually have a business continuity plan, you can have a backup plan, you can have a DR plan for all your workloads that actually get deployed in Azure Stack, as well as a recovery plan for Azure Stack itself, if and when, unfortunately, Azure Stack gets, the system gets damaged because of fire or hazard and so on and so forth. And then we've invested a lot in security and privacy to make sure that the underlying appliance-like model for Azure Stack is thoroughly secure and prevents anybody from actually coming in. And if they do come in, we've got protections in place to make sure that the damage that they can do as a consequence of that is highly limited. So before I move forward, I want to talk a little bit about how should you think about the scale of Azure Stack. How many of you know what the current scale of Azure Stack is? Just raise your hands. Okay, good. So let me start by first explaining conceptually what the scale of Azure Stack look like. And again, let's start with Azure. If you go to Azure today, right, you go to the Azure portal. The Azure portal can allow you to deploy resources in Singapore, in India, in Australia, in US West, US East. There are many, many locations or regions in Azure where you can actually go deploy resources to, right? And each of those regions in the context of Azure constitutes multiple data centers. So similarly, in the context of Azure Stack, you can have as a customer a single cloud endpoint where your customers can actually log into the endpoint and they'll be able to deploy resources across multiple regions that you may have. So for example, you may have a service provider in Europe who has a data center in Norway, in Sweden, and in Finland. And each of these data centers will then show up as different regions in the context of your customers. And they'll be able to select whether I want to deploy in Norway, Finland. Now, under the covers in each region, you will have one or more scale units. This picture here is a scale unit, right? If I can get there. Yeah, that thing is a scale unit, right? And that scale unit is the picture that I had on the previous slide, which is those minimum 4 servers. And so important thing to recognize is that Azure Stack today supports obviously one cloud endpoint. It supports one region, and within one region you can have one scale unit. And in that scale unit you can have anywhere from 4 to 12 physical servers. And it's really a partner's choice to decide whether they want to offer you 5 or whether they want to offer you in chunks of 4, 8, or 12, right? And so over time, what will happen is that, Azure Stack, as we evolve and mature, and we learn from you as to how your deployments are going, we will then add the ability to have multiple scale units within a region, and then we'll also increase the number of regions that a single Azure Stack instance supports. So that's how you'll be able to get scale. So the architecture of Azure Stack accounts for the fact that you can have increased scalability. The other important thing to recognize is that each of these scale units has homogeneous hardware. This hardware cannot be heterogeneous. So you can't mix a Broadwell system with a Purley system, for example. Or even more importantly, you can't mix like one of the servers happens to have 512 gigs of memory and the other happens to have 256 gigs of memory. That is not allowed in Azure Stack. So all the servers in an Azure Stack scale unit will be actually consistent and identical in terms of BIOS versions, the amount of storage that they have, the CPU that they have, and the amount of memory that they have. Okay? So the scale of Azure Stack, roughly the total number of the servers that you'll have under an Azure Stack instance then becomes a multiplication factor of how many servers you have in your scale unit, how many scale units you have in a region, and how many regions you have in your Azure Stack instance. Make sense? All right. So let me talk a little bit about how we think about security when we talked about Azure Stack. Now, this is a really important aspect of how Azure Stack is designed. The first principle to recognize is this concept called assume breach. What assume breach really means is that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when you will get breached, right? The attackers are so advanced that they are going to breach you. So if you start with that philosophy, then our design goal is to make sure that even if a hacker gets in, the amount of damage that they can do in the context of Azure Stack is highly limited because they do not have access to much of the system when they break in from a particular vector, right? So we internally, for example, all our services use just enough administration, which limits the scope of access that they have when they go to the corresponding endpoint on the other side, right? Obviously, Azure Stack is an appliance, so it's completely locked down. You cannot, for example, log into the Hyper-V host or any of the virtual machines that run our software to try and run your own software or try and run commands there. But we do require, sometimes you need the ability to actually go in and interact with the system with a more privileged manner, if you will, right? And for that, we have provided what is called as a privileged endpoint, which is a PowerShell GIA endpoint, which gives you constrained access to a small subset of commands that you can actually run. And I'll give you a little bit of a demo on what that means later on as well. It is hardened by default. And what I mean by that is that we've done all the work to understand, after we've laid out all the networks, which ports need to be open, which machine can talk to which machine, and therefore we've got ACLs in place both on the physical space as well as in the virtual space to make sure that inadvertent communication cannot happen. We encrypt all the backend storage by default, so even if a malicious administrator walks into the data center and walks out with a disk, that disk will be useless because it's completely encrypted. Okay. The next thing, and we keep repeating this to customers, is you got to keep your systems updated. And in order to make sure that that happens, Azure Stack has a fairly advanced and sophisticated patch and update capability, which allows you as customers to actually keep Azure Stack updated in a monthly basis, right? The last thing is, a lot of you work in highly regulated industries, and you need your systems to be actually compliant with a certain set of, compliance standards. And I use the term a little more carefully because it is not the physical system, it is what is actually given compliance. It is actually your operation of that system that is certified to be compliant with a particular standard. So a service provider can claim that they are PCI DSS by making sure that they meet the technology requirements of PCI DSS. They actually have the people and processes in place to make sure that they're compliant with PCI DSS. So what we are doing is that we will give you a filled out spreadsheet for these two compliance standards. One is the PCI DSS, and the other is called the Cloud Computing Matrix. And this one is important because it actually is a superset of the technology controls that are required for a variety of other compliance standards. So we've tried to make it really easy for you to actually achieve compliance with these standards in the context of Azure Stack. Okay? So how should you think about planning for Azure Stack? Well, the first thing you need to decide, what are you going to use Azure Stack for? If you're going to use Azure Stack for example, if you're planning to use it initially for just a proof of concept, well, then we have a version of Azure Stack that's just suitable for the proof of concept. It's a one-node software that you can download and just use it in a one-node configuration for you to be able to do POCs. But if you're going to deploy it in production, then you need to decide who is your vendor of choice. It may be one, it may be more. You need to decide whether you're going to operate in connected mode or disconnected mode. Now, the difference between these two modes is that if you're working in disconnected mode, you cannot then operate with the business model in Azure Stack, which is pay-as-you-go, right? Because in pay-as-you-go, whatever resources you're consuming in Azure Stack, we send up the abstracted information of that into Azure, so you get one Azure bill at the end of the month, which says you consume blah, blah, blah services from Azure, and here are the amount of consumption that you had on Azure Stack. So it's important. You need to decide whether your application requirements allow you to connect to the internet and allow you to connect to Azure or don't allow you to connect to Azure. Because then you, as Azure Stack operators and Azure Stack architects, are going to have to make a decision about what business model you're going to use in the context of Azure Stack. You need to identify what kind of an identity system will you use in the context of Azure Stack. Because you can either use ADFS or you can use AAD. Now, if you're working in a disconnected environment, then obviously you can only use ADFS. But if you are working in a connected environment where you're open to connecting to Azure, You still have the option of using both AAD or ADFS. So you've got a choice at that point of time. You need to understand what workloads do you plan to offer to your customers. Is it only IaaS? Is it only PaaS? Is it a combination of PaaS and IaaS? And if it's PaaS, which of the PaaS services are your customers asking for? Then once you've done all of that, then, and I'm showing you a little bit of a tool here, you need to start understanding how big of a system do you need. Do you need 4 servers? Do you need 8? And in those 8 servers, how much memory do you need in the system? Do you need 256 gigs of memory, or do you need 512 gigs of memory? You can go to your partner and get different choices of storage. Do you need less storage, more storage? So then you have to do all that planning with the partner. Then after you've done this, you also need to understand that eventually you're going to have to construct these things called plans and offers, which is how customers actually buy services from you or acquire services from you. Now, a plan is pretty similar to what a cell phone plan is. Now, at least here in the US, when you go to a particular cell phone carrier like AT&T, you can buy different plans. One plan will say, for $40 a month, I'll give you, unlimited voice, but only 500 text messages and 1 gigabyte of data, right? And given today's day and age, I don't know what 500 text messages mean to anybody. But anyway, the point is that you do have the ability for creating these different plans which have different capabilities. Similarly, you can actually create plans which can say that, look, I'm going to offer customers the ability to deploy 30 virtual machines and 10 websites. And there's a different plan which says, I'm going to allow you to create 10 databases, 10 websites, and 10 virtual machines. And these end up being different plans. They can have different billing material that you offer to your customer from that perspective. You have to decide, how are you going to make sure that your applications have a backup plan and a DR plan? And it is important to recognize that in Azure Stack, you have to think of backing up and disaster recovery for your applications differently from what you think of the underlying infrastructure, right? That's a very important distinction between Azure and how you would do it in a previously, like a virtualization environment, for example. And then you obviously need to go pick who your solution partner is, right? So like I said, there are 2 deployment options for Azure Stack. There is a single node version called Azure Stack Development Kit, and then there is a multi-node integrated system which comes from the partners that I spoke about, right? So the Azure Stack Development Kit is basically software that you can download from Microsoft. You run it on one physical server, and you can then get the full experience or almost full experience of Azure Stack, but it's primarily focused on giving your developers the ability to try and develop their applications. Now, obviously, you're not going to run performance tests in the context of a single node deployment, but you can certainly do functional testing. You can get a basic understanding of how to create plans, offers. You can get a basic understanding of how the system operates, right? So that's what you can use Azure Stack Development Kit for. And you use it for demos. You have to redeploy it though, because there is no update capability in Azure Stack Development Kit. And our goal is to make a fresh version of ASDK available every month. So you need to redeploy it, because after some time it'll become stale. So you need to do that. The multi-node integrated systems are obviously the ones that you want to deploy in production. Like I said, starts anywhere from 4 to 12 servers. It's fully validated hardware, and you've got a choice of partners that you can actually get Azure Stack integrated systems from. So, so this is an example sizing to just show you what it means. And I think the one I'd like to draw your attention to is, well, let me put it this way. In Azure Stack, right, there is no knob which says that I will allow 1:3 over provisioning of CPU, or I'll allow 1:5. That really is a choice that you have to make as an Azure Stack operator, because you dictate the number of VMs that actually get deployed on your system, and you can constrain it by the quota that you offer on your plans and offers, right? So you have to take into account that when you're doing capacity planning, you have to make sure that you account for how many VMs you want to get deployed, because that will then dictate what the virtual to physical core ratio will end up being. So rather than actually showing you, that sample, I'm going to give you a demo of a toolkit that we're going to make available in the month of October. And this Azure SaaS Siting tool is a sample tool, in the sense that it is not meant for you to sort of do final calculations of what it means to be the capacity for a system, but you can use it to get some basic understanding of what that how much capacity will be done from a system itself. So what you see here on the screen is that Azure Stack resource calculator, right? It actually has various tabs. If you actually go see here, there are some basic instructions. You can, this defines what the solution SKUs are. So if you actually go see here, you'll find that we've defined 4 different SKUs here, which talks about what is the kind of CPU that's there that dictates the number of cores, for example, here, right? How much memory is there in the system. This one happens to have 256. This one happens to have 512. It talks about what the HBA is, but if you go further down, it also talks about the disk capacity that it has, right? So for example, here it's using a capacity disk of 4 terabytes, whereas in this case, it happens to use a capacity disk of 6 terabytes, right? So once you have all these SKUs defined, and I'm going to take a very simple example deployed by VM footprint. Now, the important thing to recognize is that in Azure Stack, the VM sizes that you can deploy are only Azure sizes, right? Because this is Azure. So you'll get all the Azure sizes that we have available on Azure Stack. So what this shows you is all the Azure sizes that are available in Azure Stack as we ship. So you get base A0, DS4, DS11, DS1, V2, and so on and so forth. So in this particular example, I have filled out how many of these particular VM sizes do I anticipate deploying in the context of Azure Stack, right? And I'm just, and if you go here, you'll actually see for each of these SKUs, for example, right? It shows you for each of these SKUs, given that particular VM profile, how many VMs you're deploying of a particular type, what is the amount of memory you will have free, what is the kind of CPU consumption that you will have, right? Now, the other point I'd like to make out here is if you actually look at this particular line, right? It says physical scores, physical CPU cores. It gives you a number, 49, 106. But if you actually go do the math in terms of what we actually started out with, this number won't exactly match that. Any idea why it won't match that? Anybody? Great point. The reason it doesn't match that is because, remember, the hyperconverged architecture. So in Azure Stack, we are going to run Azure Stack software itself, where we run the portal, where we run ARM, where we run all the resource providers. So this number that you see here is after deducting what we need to run Azure Stack itself. So this gives you really what is the actual resources that are available to you from a memory perspective, from a CPU perspective, to actually run user workloads on Azure Stack. So it's a pretty powerful tool. We're just refining it a little better. And in October, we plan to make it available for you to be able to do some initial basic sizing. The important thing you have to recognize that final sizing has to be done with the hardware vendor, because I've just picked 6 terabyte drives. You actually have to work with the vendor. They may actually have better information about what drives are available, and they may have all sorts of options which may not be captured by this basic tool. But the intention of this for you is to at least get a basic idea. Am I looking at buying 12 servers or 8 servers? And things like that, right? So this is a good tool that we intend to make available for you to be able to go make that happen. Make sense? All right, so let's go back. And I've done the demo. All right, so now that you've done all the, the capacity planning, you'll have gone and placed an order with the hardware vendor, right? Now, the way Azure Stack integrates into your data center in a very simplistic manner is like this. So here I've shown you a 4-server Azure Stack integrated system, which integrates with a layer 3 connectivity. Our preferable route is to actually use BGP between the top of rack switches and the border devices. That's the ideal way to do it, but you can also use static routes. But it is layer 3 connectivity between the top of rack switch and the border devices. And then, you obviously need to provide power, and you need to integrate it into your identity subsystem. Like I said before, you can use ADFS or you can use AAD. And then you need to decide, whether you want to have the alerts and monitoring information that is there in Azure Stack surface into your existing management estate like Operations Manager or Nagios or any other tool. You need to make all those decisions. And it is you who have to go decide how to make all of this happen. But the insides of Azure Stack, how the networking is laid out, that is of no concern to you, because that's all done between us and the hardware partner. And when the system shows up in your data centers, the insides have all been configured. The physical switches are configured, they're deployed correctly, and they're provisioned correctly. So all that is already done. What you have to really focus on is this border connectivity to make sure that you have the right connectivity, and we collect some information for you to actually go do the deployment. So now, what all does an Azure Stack operator do? Actually, I beg your pardon. Before I do this, I want to show you another tool that you will need to work with your hardware partner, and you will need to provide the information to them so that they can actually do the deployment of Azure Stack correctly. So this is called a deployment worksheet. Right? So the first worksheet that you worked with was the sizing tool, right? You do get some basic sizing, then work with your hardware partner to do the right sizing, actual sizing, have the order placed. Once they have placed the order, then the hardware partner will work with you on this deployment worksheet. This deployment worksheet captures the information that is required for the hardware partner to actually deploy Azure Stack. Right? Things like, what identity system are you going to use, right? It captures information, for example, on the network settings. There are multiple physical networks that we require inside Azure Stack. It captures what is the IP ranges that you are going to provide from your networks into Azure Stack. So it captures all of this information in the context of this sizing tool. So the moment you've placed the order, or even while you're placing the order, you need to make sure you work with your hardware partner and start filling this out. And based on our experience, the first thing you need to start filling out is this networking tab. It is the most difficult to get right, because in environments like yours, or from our experience, it takes a lot of time to get the networking information gathered, collated, sifted through, and it is correct before you give it to the hardware partner. What the hardware partner will do is, after they have actually got all these worksheets filled out, then there is automation within the sheet. They actually generate a bunch of JSON files from this, which then they use to actually configure the physical switches inside Azure Stack, right? And then the output from that is actually fed into the automation that we have developed for deploying Azure Stack. So what all you fill in here will impact how the Azure Stack instance gets deployed and integrated into your data center. Make sense? So important to note that the moment you've placed the order, you need to start working with your hardware partner to fill this out accurately. All right. So now that it's happened, it's good. So now let's talk about what all does an Azure Stack operator really have to do. So obviously you've done all the work earlier of planning what the system looks like, how big it needs to be. You need to work with your application architects. You need to work with your cloud architects to make sure that you have an idea of how to actually size the system, what's the right size of the system. But once it's actually deployed, you have to monitor the health of the infrastructure. You will be responsible for deploying and monitoring additional Azure services, because your company may demand that, look, I need SQL DB, I need web apps, and I need IaaS. Now, things like web apps are not available by default in Azure Stack. Remember, I told you that Azure Stack, you have to deploy additional services from an Azure perspective, depending on what's available. There is a whole bunch of things that are available in the marketplace of Azure, and you have to decide whether you need Kemp load balancers, whether you need to offer Ubuntu images, whether you want to offer 2012 R2 or 2016. So all that's your job. So you have to go populate what that marketplace looks like in your local gallery. You're going to be responsible for patching and update the system, depending upon how, based on the updates that we provide to you. Then, Azure Stack has an internal alerting system. It'll throw up alerts in the context of capacity. It may throw up alerts because of disk failures and so on and so forth. That's your responsibility to make sure that you go react to those alerts. In case things really go south and you do have to go engage with support, you can engage with Microsoft or hardware partner from a support standpoint. You will be responsible for integrating the alerting system that's there in Azure Stack into your existing estate like Operations Manager or Nagios. You are also responsible for making sure that the Azure Stack infrastructure, you schedule regular backups for it, depending upon what your needs are. And then you also have to rotate certificates, because Azure Stack, we ask you to provide us certificates, which we use in the context of the portal and all external facing endpoints in the context of Azure Stack. And those certificates will require rotation. So we provide you the tooling, but that's all going to be your task to go make that happen. All right? So what tools are we making available for you to be able to actually operate Azure Stack? So at its base level, there is an administrative portal, which if you went to Jason Zander's keynote, Natalia actually showed this portal. This administrative portal, under the covers, uses Azure Resource Manager and uses the same portal technology that is there in the user portal. So you get all the benefits of role-based access control and all those capabilities, right? So this is where you will spend most of your life. But sometimes you need to automate things. So what all is available for the most part in the portal is also available in PowerShell. So you can then use PowerShell to automate tasks in the context of Azure Stack. The next thing is, in case the system, there are times when Azure Resource Manager is not available. Either it is not available because something has gone wrong, or there are some tasks which you cannot do through Azure Resource Manager. A classic example is when you need to rotate certificates, because rotation of certificates actually impacts the ARM endpoint itself. And therefore, in that case, there is we've made this tool available called the privileged endpoint. It's a GIA PowerShell endpoint, again PowerShell, but it gives you a constrained set of commandlets that you can run in there, and that's where you'll be able to operate Azure Stack. So top line, you need PowerShell skills, and you need basic skills of understanding how these architectures are laid out for you to be able to do this. And this will really allow you to focus on the SLA that you want to offer to your customers in the context of Azure Stack. Okay? So what I'm going to do now is first, before I actually go and show you the demo, I'm going to show you a brief picture of what Azure Stack really looks like under the covers. Now I'll show you this picture and then I'll blank it out and say it really doesn't matter. But there are some elements of this that you will see in your day-to-day life. Basically, in Azure Stack, right, anytime there is a resource that's offered through the portal for consumption, there is a backing resource provider for it. So if there is a VM that you're creating, it's backed by a compute resource provider. If there is storage accounts that you're creating and blobs and tables you're creating, it is surfaced through the storage resource provider. Whenever you're creating a virtual network, it is done through what is called as a network resource provider, right? And then you will actually notice that there are some other, resource providers here, which is called HRP and URP. Now these are infrastructure or operator-related resource providers. HRP happens to be the health resource provider, which is where we surface up alerts from. And then we have the update resource provider, which allows you to interact with the system to update the provider. Now architecturally, each of these resource providers is backed by an underlying controller, right? So you have a bunch of these controllers, and then there's a whole bunch of ancillary infrastructure that sits under the covers, which actually backs all of the software that runs Azure Stack. Now, the next thing shows you that these are internals. And the reason we do this side is that you're not going to be able to go change what this looks like, right? But the reason it is important for you to at least basically understand what this is, because a lot of these controllers actually do show up in the UI. And you'll need to understand whether they are healthy, not healthy, what actions can you take in the context of those particular resource providers and backend controllers. But the fact that you're obviously not going to be able to change it, that's why we sort of put the slide up for you to sort of understand that context and make that starkly clear. So now that you've actually seen the basic layout of what this looks like, let's go actually take a look at an Azure Stack deployment and see what it looks like. All right. All right, so this is, I'm logged into the Azure Stack administrative portal, right? So first of all, the technology that is used by this portal is the same technology that's used in Azure. The code name for that was Ibiza. So it's the same technology, but it is a portal instance that is running separate from the user portal in Azure Stack. The user portal runs on a completely different head, and the administrative portal runs on a completely different head. So they're two different portals, right? Now, and for sort of visual reasons, we have sort of colored them differently, but like at the Azure portal, this is entirely customizable, right? I just happen to know that I don't, okay, this one is not doing too well. Let's go to a different one. All right, so I just happen to, I'm familiar with Azure Stack, so therefore I don't really need the quick start tutorial. I'm fully within my right to actually go and customize this dashboard. And like, for example, I can go change the name, just like I can do in the context of Azure. And I can remove aspects of the portal that don't actually make sense for me, right? It's entirely within my ability to actually customize this portal. And like, for example, if I don't want to have this, I can just completely remove this, right? Now, let's go back to the diagram that we talked about, which talked about how Azure Stack scales. We said that there can be multiple regions in Azure Stack. Now, it so happens that this particular Azure Stack instance, because right now we support only one region, is telling you that I have only one Redmond region here. Now, over time, when we support multiple regions, you'll see the list of regions show up in this user experience. So let's go take a look at what that Redmond region looks like. Let's click on here. And just like Azure, you get the same flow and the blade tiling and so on and so forth, right? So it gives me context about what's happening in the context of that particular region. Now let's go back, and if you go back to the architecture picture, remember there were a bunch of resource providers, so it is telling you what those resource providers are and what their health is. It's telling me that I've got an alert from capacity, which we'll come back to later. You can go down here and you can take a look at the other infrastructure roles that exist in Azure Stack, right? And you can see what the status of those looks like. Let's take a look here and see what that's looking like. I've got a whole bunch of roles. I can go and see the whole bunch of other roles as well. Right? So you actually see a whole bunch of these roles. So if you remember the diagram that we were looking at, it had a whole bunch of roles and controllers like the directory system that we have, the backend data store that we have, Key Vault, and so on and so forth. So it's telling you what the status of each of these is. And internally, what's happening is that each of these components is measuring the health of their system and reporting it to the monitoring system, which is telling it whether the system is healthy or not. Okay? Now, I want to go see what does this actual multi-node system looks like. So let's go take a look at how many scale units are there in the system. Okay, it's telling me I happen to have one scale unit. It's hyper-converged. So let's click on this one and see what happens. And what you'll see, what will show up is that what are the number of servers that constitute this particular scale unit. Okay, so it's come up here. It's showing me that I have 8 nodes in this particular scale unit. So now you know as an administrator, even if you did not know before, that this system actually has 8 servers in this particular scale unit. And then you can actually literally go into the details of a particular node and see what the details of that node are. So it will tell you, how many cores it has. It will tell you what kind of a model. This one happens to be a Dell 730XD. And it tells you what the BMC IP address is. Now, sometimes you do need to actually go to the BMC to do tasks, and that's why it gives you these things, this information. Notice up here, I have a bunch of actions that I can actually take on this particular node. I can drain the node, which means that if this server is misbehaving, the moment I click drain, we will attempt to remove all the workloads that are running on this workload on the system and move it out to a different system on that particular cluster, if you will. Right? You notice there is also a repair option, and the repair option basically all it does is it redeploys the system entirely afresh, so that if there's any problem because of the existing deployment configuration or something that's wrong, you can actually repair it, right? And then there's a power off option, which I don't think I should do right now because I'll mess up a whole bunch of other demos if I do that. So this is a very simple experience for you to be able to understand what this looks like. All right, so now let's go back here and see what's going on. All right, so I was told that there is actually a warning here. Okay, so let's go click on what that warning looks like and see what the warning says. Okay, it says that a capacity has been lost to a physical disk. Okay, let's go take a look at how I need to remediate that particular problem that I seem to be having. So what we have tried to do is to make sure that we give you clear instructions in case you receive an alert. The first thing you noticed was that even though a disk is bad, you noticed that you only got a warning alert. And the reason you got a warning alert is because internally the system has resiliency. It has resiliency to switches failing, it has resiliency to NICs failing, it has resiliency to disks failing, it has resiliency to servers failing. That's all accounted for in the architecture. And so the fact that a disk has failed obviously does not bring down the system, but is important for you to then take a look at it and then order and work with your hardware partner to actually have the disk replaced, right? And so you have to make sure that you have the appropriate, agreements with your partner, whether you want the disk to be replaced in 4 hours, next business day, or whatever the case may be, right? Now, you should know that in case the number of disks that have failed increases beyond a certain limit, the type of alert will change to being a more critical alert, right? So that's an important thing that you have to watch for when disks are actually failing in this manner, right? Okay, let me go back. Let me go back to the other one and see if this one, get this one to work. Yeah. There's a different alert I wanted to show you on that one to see if that works, but let's see if that comes back. All right, so it seems like it's back. So this one actually has a slightly different alert. So it's actually showing you a capacity alert. And what it's really telling you is that there is a public IP VIP pool that you have. And what it's telling you is that that VIP pool seems to be running out of capacity. So if you actually go here, you'll see that this VIP pool happens to be 84% full, right? And if you see here, you'll see that the VIP pool is 84% full, and that's where you actually got the alert. Now, obviously, we recognize the fact that this can happen fairly often, so you can actually go here and then add an IP pool. You obviously have to work with your networking team to make sure that you have that capability. And then you fill in this stuff, and then you click OK, and then the IP pool will be added. Once the pool is added effectively, naturally the IP usage then reduces as a part of the capacity, and then or as a percentage, and then you should be fine, right? All right. So this gives you alerts in the context of anything that's going on from a health perspective. Now let's go back to the main page and see what else I can see. Actually, before I go there, one of the other tasks I said that you as an operator need to do is you need to basically populate the marketplace based on items that your customers desire. So let's take a look at what marketplace management offers me. So if I look at marketplace management, first of all, it is showing me what are the elements that are available for my customers to deploy today. So if I were to go into this Azure Stack instance from the user side and click new, I'll be able to deploy one or more of these workloads from there. But in case you haven't downloaded the one that you need, you can actually go just say add from Azure. And what this will do is it will actually tell us what all is available in the context of Azure for you to be able to download and make it available in the context of your Azure Stack instance, right? So you can select any particular one, right? And then all you need to do, you get the details, and you can actually just click download, and this particular marketplace item will then be available for you to download and use in the context of your Azure Stack instance. Make sense? All right. Now, let's go back here. And the next task that you're going to be doing as Azure Stack operators is you're going to be required to update the system, right? So if you notice here, there's a tile here for update, which is telling me that there is an update that's actually available. So let's go click on the tile and see what it tells me. So it's telling me that there is an update that's available for me to be able to apply to this particular Azure Stack instance. There is a full link where I can get more details of what particular issues have been fixed, what new capabilities are coming in the context of this particular update. And then more importantly, I can actually just go here and either here or I can go right here and click update now. And what this update now will do is it will orchestrate the application of this update across the entire Azure Stack instance. So it will update the virtual machines that run our software. It will update ARM, it will update Portal, Key Vault, virtual IaaS, the IaaS backend, CRP, NRP, SRP, URP, all those things will get updated. What it will not update is any workloads that you have deployed. Just like in Azure, when you deploy a workload, the responsibility of workload is yours. Similarly, in Azure Stack, the responsibility of updating the workloads that you deploy in Azure Stack are the responsibility of you. And you can use any tools that are there at your disposal, including the new that was showed off in the keynote about OMS patching and so on and so forth. So you can use that in the context of user space. But here, what you're really updating is the underlying infrastructure, right? Now, in this place, you will also see two types of updates. You will see OEM updates and you will see Azure Stack updates. The way this works is that Azure Stack software updates will never take a dependency on the hardware partner update, right? But the hardware partner update can say that, look, I need to have a particular version of Azure Stack in there. The other thing is, like I said earlier, updates will come out on a monthly basis. If you choose not to take them, you can defer an update for up to 3 months. But we really want you to remain current. And importantly so, not just because of security reasons, it's also important because our updates are not cumulative. What that means is that if you defer updates for 2 months and then decide you want to take an update, you're going to have to take the first update, and then you're going to have to take the second update, right? And our recommendation when you take an update or when you're running an update is that you call a maintenance window for your workloads. Although it's not necessarily that all the workloads will go down during updates, but it is possible that some workloads do go down while we are doing updates. That pertains to how we patch the gateways through which the networking traffic is flowing through. They can actually take a little bit of downtime. And in occasions, some of the workloads, the VMs may also have to go down when we actually patch the underlying infrastructure. So it's important to let your customers know that you're going to be patching the system while you're, and call a maintenance window, right? And then obviously our intention is to continue to improve on PNU and get better and better with PNU and taking shorter and shorter time and reducing the amount of downtime that you take while you're doing the update. All right, so this experience is what it looked like in the context of the portal. Now let's go take a look at what you can do in the context of PowerShell. So I've got a PowerShell session that I've configured to hit the same endpoint that I was in the context of Azure Stack. So let's do this. Let's just run a simple PowerShell command which says get AZS alert, okay? Now let's see what it does. All right, this is fantastic, and I'm sure some of you have the ability to parse what it said while it was scrolling through. I unfortunately don't. So I'm just going to do something really simple. I'm going to do get AZS alert. I'm going to pipe it through, and I'm going to right. Let's do $_dot state. I'm just looking for alerts that happen to be active. And because right now it showed me, if you notice carefully, it showed me the alerts, all alerts which have actually been in the system, right? And right now it is showing me only one particular alert. If you actually look carefully, this was the alert that was where connectivity was lost to the physical disk, right? The reason I'm showing you this PowerShell is that because some of you would love to go doing the UI, but like I said, some of your task is going to involve integrating this into a broader estate of management. So using these kinds of PowerShell commandlets, you can then write a system outside which can continually poll this for poll what alerts are available and then plug them into an external system. And in fact, we have a sample code that's available for how you would plug these alerts into Nagios. We have an operations center management pack, and in fact, I think Charlie is going to demo that as well later today, if I'm not mistaken. So you can actually have all the alerts flow into an operations manager environment as well, right? Now, if you go back to there are many benefits that you'll get from this integration, and in that later session, you'll actually hear all the benefits of doing something like that as well. All right? All right, so this covered the day-to-day operations that you will do. You will use PowerShell and you will use the portal to actually communicate with Azure Stack and manage and operate it. Now, the next thing I told you was that in case you happen to be in a situation where the system is down, you need to diagnose it, or you need to do certain tasks which cannot be done through ARM and portal, then you need to do what is called as going into the privileged endpoint, right? Now, the privileged endpoint is actually a PowerShell endpoint which sits within Azure Stack, and as a part of your deployment, you'll be given the IP addresses of what that privileged endpoint look like, right? And so here, there's a very simple script. All it's doing is just configuring the trusted host, and it is going to enter a PowerShell session with that environment. Okay, let's try and run this. So I am going to log in. I'm sorry. Yes. All right, let's see if I type that correct. And if I type that correct, I will basically get into this PowerShell session. All right, so now if you notice, I'm actually in a PowerShell session. However, this PowerShell session is special. It isn't a regular PowerShell session. You're not going to get all the commandlets that you get. In fact, you don't even get tab support, right? That's how constrained it is. And you get only a very small subset of PowerShell commandlets that you can run here. So let's first see what commands are actually available here. And so when you go into a PowerShell session for the privileged endpoint, these are the subset of commands that are available for you to operate in the context of Azure Stack, right? And you'll notice some very simple tasks, right? Like, for example, if you happen to work with support, you'll be able to require to get cluster logs, right? Sometimes you may need to actually stop Azure Stack. You may need to start Azure Stack. You may need to set what is the telemetry actions that you want this Azure Stack to be able to do, right? So all this is available for you in the context of the privileged endpoint, right? And when you work with customer support, a number of times you'll actually be working in the context of this privileged endpoint. Now, there is a way to actually unlock the privileged endpoint in case you want elevated privileges when working with customer support to get more details. And there is more details in that to be covered by a session with Filippo and Jeffrey Snover. I think that session is tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. And there they'll show you more details of how the system actually gets locked. But it's like a locker in the bank. There are two keys to open it. One key is with you as the customer. One key is with us as Microsoft or the hardware partner. And both keys have to be turned for that system to be unlocked. And the moment we finish that session, that system will be locked back again. This is what prevents anything inadvertent to happen in the context of Azure Stack. All right? All right. So now let's go back to the slides. And so now let's talk a little bit about what it means for backup and disaster recovery. So this is a very simple Azure Stack which has some infrastructure. It has IaaS and PaaS services that are actually deployed. Let's talk about backup. First and foremost, you have to recognize that there is everything above the dotted line. You have to think about what kind of a strategy you would have in Azure for your applications. So we support, third-party software like Veeam, Commvault, and others who actually support backup in Azure. You can actually run them in Azure Stack to be able to back up virtual machines and other assets outside of Azure Stack, just like as you would do. You can also use Azure Backup to actually back up your virtual machines and other assets into Azure itself. For some of the PaaS services, you can actually snapshot the blob. You can use AZ copy and all the tools that are available for you in the context of Azure Stack. In Azure as well, right? You also have the ability to back up SQL using SQL capabilities either just off the stamp or into Azure itself. In case of DR, we support using Azure Site Recovery to be able to replicate a virtual machine from on the stamp into Azure. So you can actually have a disaster recovery plan which actually replicates a virtual machine from Azure Stack into Azure. What we don't support right now is the ability to replicate a virtual machine between two different Azure Stack instances. We have the feedback from you and we plan to support that in the future, but right now we support failing up into Azure through Azure Site Recovery. Now, from an infrastructure perspective, right, the goal, first of all, is not to be able to say I back up all my assets from the infrastructure. All you're backing up in the context of Azure Stack infrastructure is the important metadata information which allows you to restore the personality of an Azure Stack instance if something goes wrong with Azure Stack. Let's say you're in a data center and because of rain, this rack completely gets destroyed. In that case, this backup will be of huge benefit to you because you call up the hardware vendor, you either take the same hardware if it is still operational or get fresh hardware, deploy it afresh, and then you'll be able to hydrate the personality of that stamp from that backup that you had available. So you'll get the basic stamp operational. Then you go into phase 2 of the recovery where you actually restore your backup of the tenant or user workloads separately from the infrastructure. So important to note that the backup that we maintain for the infrastructure is for the purpose of recovering from a complete failure of the Azure Stack instance. Make sense? So this is something that you have to think about and plan for when you plan your backup and disaster recovery plans. So now that you've done this, recognize that sometimes you do need help and support, and we have worked really hard with our hardware partners to make sure that support experiences for you are completely seamless, right? So from our perspective, you can call either the hardware partner or us. There's no difference who you call, right? And each of us will make sure that we will close that ticket and take it to resolution and not do finger pointing, say, no, it's their fault, no, it's my fault, right? Simple, you can call anybody. However, our guidance is that if you know distinctly that the issue happens to be a disk failure, then it is preferable to call the hardware vendor. If you know that you're trying to patch the firmware of a system, call the hardware vendor. For everything else, call us. However, the first statement that I made, which says you can call anybody, always holds. But a recommendation is that if you know exactly where the problem lies, it's better off if you start off with that particular hardware partner, right? And then we've done a lot of work in the back end to make sure that when we collect the logs, it's not that you call up the hardware vendor and they'll collect the logs, and then when they hand the phone to us, we say, okay, let's collect the logs all over again. No, we've got a back end system to make sure that the logs can be transferred between either of us. The ticket information, all of us gets transferred. There's a lot of work that we've done to make sure that that happens in the back end. All right? So in summary, Azure Stack is a pay-as-you-go model, just like in Azure, right? And that has a big impact on whether you want to operate in connected mode or disconnected mode, right? It is delivered as a continuously validated integrated system between us and the hardware partners. And the goal of this is to highly simplify how you operate Azure Stack in your data center. So you can really focus on providing higher level value to your business, to the application developers, and help them innovate in the context of Azure Stack. Make sense? So I'm happy to take questions at this point of time. I think we have some time. Yes, please. Please come up to the mic so it's a little easy for, yes, we've got a few minutes.
When my customer has, for example, uses a SQL database and is running on the Azure Stack or in Azure itself, and we have 3 months to update the service.
Yeah.
So, for example, it goes from Service Pack 1 to Service Pack 2. How does the customer go along with it?
Okay, so the question was, if I've got SQL Server and I need to update it, like 3 months, like you said. Remember, SQL Server is deployed in the user space. So we don't dictate what.
But you have the SQL instance. This is what I will offer the SQL instance to the user.
Right, but that SQL instance is not updated by the Azure Stack update mechanism.
Okay.
What we only update is the software that is deployed out of the box with Azure Stack. If you have deployed a SQL farm to offer a SQL service to your customers, you are responsible for patching it and maintaining it.
Thank you.
Great. Good question.
You can also download an updated VHD from the marketplace if Azure is patched. It won't already.
It's a deployed instance that you was talking about. Fair, but that's a good point. I will touch upon that point. So there's a good point that was made that, look, you should keep your marketplace items regularly updated from Azure, because Azure updates images. So if you want to, just get the freshest image so that new instances will get the patched example. That you can certainly do. Yes.
With the telemetry, are you able to offer proactive support? So from the vendor, like if a hard drive fails, they just phone you and say, hey, the tech will be on site tomorrow.
So the question was, with the telemetry, can you offer proactive support like a disk fails? There is telemetry that the hardware partners, there is software that the hardware partners run in the HLH. In fact, for hardware monitoring, Azure Stack doesn't really have anything much. Hardware monitoring is done through the hardware lifecycle host. And almost all partners actually do have the ability to find out if a disk has gone bad, and they may offer such a service, but Microsoft does not, right? We don't have anything that we do from a proactive support perspective today in the context of Azure Stack. But it is certainly something that we would love to explore in the future, assuming that's what you folks actually want. Yes, please.
We were talking about scaling it to multiple regions. So can these regions be also used as a DR? Will it replicate the data across the DR, across the regions if required? Or is that built into the stack?
So the question is that when we have multiple regions, will you offer the ability to automatically replicate between multiple regions? It remains to be seen when we actually design multiple regions, whether we offer things. There is in Azure, there is a capability called geo-replication, geo-replicated storage. We're going to explore whether that comes as a part of the multi-region support or not. But don't assume it to be automatic.
In terms of the hardware maintenance, like firmware update and all those things, will vendor be doing that on a regular basis, or we are expected to do in coordination with vendor?
So the question is about firmware updates. The firmware updates come to you from the hardware vendor. Obviously, they do the joint validation with us. They will make the update available to you, and they'll give you tooling that you can run on the hardware lifecycle host to apply those firmware updates. Now, it depends from vendor to vendor. Some may actually offer a service to you as a part of the acquisition when you bought the hardware from them, saying, you know what, just add this much to service fee to your purchase, and then I'll take care of the updates for you. And in some cases, if you haven't done that, then they may just offer to you as a software payload, and then you have to do it. But the goal is that it's simplified and just use an automated tool to actually go make that happen. Thank you. Yes, there's a question there.
Yeah, I was questioning how about licensing, because normal from the Azure Marketplace, you also get the Windows license, for example, SQL license. How is it done in Azure Stack? Because I have the hardware owned by my company, but the license, of course, for my feeling, I still have to pay for that. But how is it done in Azure Stack?
That's a good question. So, first of all, anything that you download from the marketplace, right? There is no automatic licensing or billing that goes through Azure. You still have to pay a licensing fee for the software that runs in Azure Stack. Now, we offer two approaches for Windows. You can either license Windows on a pay-as-you-go basis, and if you go to the Azure Stack, azure.com, Azure Stack website, you'll actually see if you want to deploy Windows on a pay-as-you-go basis, how much will you pay on a per minute or a per hour basis, depending on the number of CPUs that you have in that Windows Server instance. You can also deploy a bare virtual machine and then bring your own license for your Windows Server instances, right? That is if you're going for the pay-as-you-go model. If you're using a capacity model, then you have to license all the physical cores in the infrastructure, and then you can deploy as many virtual machines, but you still have to bring the license for Windows Server and SQL separately. Make sense? All right. Yes, please.
For patching Azure Stack or updating Azure Stack, you were saying that you can get downtime for certain workloads. How much downtime should you take into account?
So the question is, I said, look, there's a potential for actually having downtime when you actually do patch and update. We are working through what the details of what that downtime look like, but in our estimation, right, in some cases, that downtime can be as high as about 2 hours per physical server. So on a 4-node system, it can roughly be 8 hours. But again, this largely depends upon what workloads are actually run. That's a worst case example, by the way. Yeah. It depends upon what is running on that system and how much workloads are actually running on the system. Yeah. It's very unpredictable to decide how much that downtime is.
Because I can imagine that you can move your workloads to another node and then...
We certainly do that, but even then, the amount of time it takes to recycle a host, reboot it, apply the configuration back can take a little bit of time.
Okay.
And actually, Justin has multiple sessions. He has theater sessions specifically on patch and update. I think those are worth going to.
Okay, we'll check it out.
And then Spencer has a session on Thursday, by the way, in case you want to understand how to do capacity planning and get more detailed understanding of the architecture. That's a session that's worth going as well. It's on Spencer Shepard. I should actually go on to this slide. So all these blue sessions are the ones that are specifically focused on infrastructure management. Yes?
Another one about backup, the infrastructure backup.
Yeah.
So it's only a manual backup, or is it also to be scheduled, or?
It is manual backup, but you can write you can write a PowerShell script which runs every so often and just triggers that backup. Yeah. Yeah. We left that as an option for you to sort of decide how to do it. Yes. Yeah, it's about a 10 gigabytes worth of data each time you take a backup. Yes. Yes.
Is there a license cost associated with Azure Stack itself?
Is there a license? So if you deploy Azure Stack and do not deploy any user workload on it, there's nothing you will pay to anybody, except what you've paid for buying the hardware.
The admin portal, is it running from on-prem or from Azure?
Good question. The admin portal is running on your Azure Stack instance, on-premise.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Is Azure Stack multi-tenant? I'm here, wiping.
Oh, there you go.
Is it multi-tenant?
Yes. Is Azure multi-tenant?
But is Azure Stack multi-tenant?
Yes.
So you can bring in, you could have a scenario where multiple customers would buy one Azure Stack. And
yes, there are many service providers who are actually buying Azure Stack and offering it to different customers of theirs. Because when you come in as an Azure Stack subscription, or when you come in as a user subscription, you're completely isolated. You cannot see the resources from other users. And the resource billing is all done on a per subscription basis, so you can get their bill and separate person's bill completely separately. So it is absolutely multi-tenanted.
And those are hooked up to the CSP per
Yes,
customer.
that is
They will
correct.
show up in the customer list in CSP.
That is correct. There is a session by Chung and Alfredo, which talks specifically about Azure Stack, a business model and support. I think you should go to that session if you want to really deeply understand how the CSP model and how the billing works.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Hi. Quick question on,
Yeah.
So in one of your slides on the identity management, you mentioned that ADFS and Azure AD are the
Yes.
supported ways. How you basically provide the SSO and role-based access control with on-prem AD?
If you don't map what, I'm sorry?
How do you provide the single sign-on and the role-based access control from your on-prem Active Directory to Azure Stack?
So the question was, how do you provide role-based access control if I'm using on-prem AD?
And single sign-on for authentication.
But are you using AAD or are you using ADFS? What scenario are you talking about? Because in either case, what happens is that once you federate your identity system, either with Azure AD or with ADFS, right? Then when we get your identity token, we can, based on that, we can actually provide role-based access control to that identity subsystem.
For on-prem, do you need to go to Azure AD?
No, you do not. You can do...
So you can do ADFS directly between your on-prem...
That is correct.
...and Azure Stack.
That is correct. There is an ADFS instance that sits inside Azure Stack, and if you do not want to go to AAD, you can just take your AD instance, federate it to the ADFS instance that's in Azure Stack, and then you do not go to Azure at all.
Okay, so do you have the same dependencies on the user principal name for ADFS?
I do not know the answer to that question, but there is a session on identity management by Shri. 4011. You should go for that session. That will give you all the details for identity management in Azure Stack. 4011.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? I'm running out of time, so just two questions, since the two of you standing here.
How many resources do all the infrastructure VMs require?
How many?
Resources do all the infrastructure VMs require to keep Azure Stack up and running?
So if you take a server system, physical server with 256 gigabytes of memory, and I think about 28 cores or so, we take approximately about one physical server worth of capacity. But it's not linear. On a 4-server system, we will take 1 physical server worth of capacity, and on a 12-server system, we'll take 1 server worth of capacity. We don't increase. Now, when we go beyond that, that number may change, but right now it is the same. Yes, last question, please.
So the infrastructure beneath, the hardware beneath, is for me as admin is completely abstracted.
Yes.
Why would I buy Cisco stack, or why would I buy a Dell stack? What would be the difference for me?
We should go ask Dell that.
No, but I mean, usually with you have difference in tools, but those tools go away. For example, do you use the Cisco deployment?
No, that's not actually, I'm being a little facetious. You know, actually, each of these systems actually brings something special to the table. First, in terms of the hardware management capabilities, each of them have their own hardware management capabilities. In terms of how the software gets updated, it is very separate to each of these hardware partners. In terms of what they offer in terms of flexibility, in terms of how many servers you can buy, that's different from each of these partners. In terms of what options they offer in terms of variations in storage, in compute, and memory, that's separate from each of these hardware partners. And each of these hardware partners has actually done a lot of work in of themselves to make sure that the deployment gets better, their support is better. So there are lots of ways that the partners actually have a completely different system. So you really have to work with your hardware partner to understand what each of them bring to the table when it comes to it. There are other examples where they have unique financing opportunities. Some hardware partners offer pay-as-you-go for hardware. If you want to go to a complete cloud model, you can go with the hardware partner for pay-as-you-go completely for hardware as well. And so there are many, many things that the hardware partners are doing to make sure that they can, that they bring value to the table.
Thank you.
Right? Thank you so much for your time, folks. Really appreciate it.